We are live, Marty.
We're live. I want that ticker to move from 0 to something. I don't want to talk to 0.
We got numbers.
Ooh. Here they come.
Twitter/X is our speediest arrival.
All right. Okay. Love it. By the way, you said Twitter/X while people are streaming in. No pun intended. I'd say that I guess my profile is back up and active. We're trying to figure out what we're going to do with all of that. I'm no longer on Twitter X, but I am on Threads. You can find me over there. All the stuff I'm posting there. Bema Impact's still on Twitter X, so still
people
over there.
People are watching it right now on that very account.
They know, absolutely. And then I'm over on Blue Sky as well. If people want to find me over there, that's another place I can be found. Obviously, all the socials, all the things. I think it's, let me see if I can turn this on. I'm not sure that light's going to last very long tonight. We'll see. We'll see if God wants to stop the light like he stopped the sun in the book of Joshua.
No, but in that case, the sun was just up in the sky. So the light was still there.
Yeah, totally. Yeah, that's what we're hoping, the light will still be there at the end of this live stream. I have my doubts, but you are correct. We're on YouTube. We're on Facebook. We're on Twitter tonight.
We have comments coming in from YouTube, comments coming in from Facebook.
All right.
People saying hello from who knows where, but all over the world, no doubt.
Yep. Absolutely. We've got a little bit less, not as much as I thought, but a little bit less of a question load tonight than usual. So
we got a whole bunch of people saying it's their first time. So What are we even doing here, Marty? How does this work?
Oh, goodness gracious. What are we doing? First timers. That's great. Maybe that will add for some lively live conversation. Our live question askers are usually Dylan and Doreen and a few others, but now we got first timers. So what do? We do this, man, if you're a first time to our live stream Q&A, we do this for a collision of reasons. Like, part of it is an opportunity to really acknowledge like the mountainous amount of emails that come in, and there's lots that don't get addressed, but we get lots of emails, lots of contact form, lots of questions that get asked in our social media inboxes. And this is like a gathering place, a parking lot. Actually, it starts on a document we call the parking lot, and it's like a parking lot where we can throw a lot of those questions and deal with those, because we like to stay in touch. We like to stay in touch with all the people and the listeners and just regular everyday folk that have good old fashioned questions. And the other reason we do this is because of questions. Like, we love just the spirit of asking questions. Like, Bema was started in part because the church needs and needed and still does need more spaces where it's okay just to think critically and be frustrated and have doubt, or to just be curious. And so this is one of those spaces where we can ask questions and we can honor questions. Hopefully part of what we're doing here is we're modeling how to receive a question, even questions that there will be questions on the document tonight that I'm like, well, that's just a crazy question. But hopefully you won't feel that from me, because it's a way of honoring and receiving those questions and just saying, yeah, there's a space for those. And maybe a question that seems weird to me is not weird at all to somebody else. And
other questions where like we see the question all the time and it's like, oh, yeah. And then we start to answer it, and then we realize, oh, there's actually something more behind this that we didn't even realize as we started talking. We're wrestling through this as I say we, you're the one doing most of the stuff, but as you're talking through it, you realize like, oh, there's a nuance to this question that even though we've had this question 100 times before, there's something else here, and we're uncovering new things together. Your questions in dialogue with our answers, quote unquote. We're not necessarily even giving answers. We're just processing this stuff and wrestling with it, right, and trying to get somewhere. We're trying to move forward.
Yeah. I've noticed a lot of places, a lot of other, trying to think of, even Bible Project does this. People call it Q&Rs, which I like that, question and a response. Mm-hmm. The joke we've always had comes from one of our staff members, Ben Casperson. He likes to say they're more like Q&A, because it's really like, it's really not. We never want it to be about the answer. if we ever think our questions are just tied up with a nice little cute answer, even some of the ones that will feel that way tonight, there's always things behind the things. And there's always things that we don't understand and nuances and complexities. And this thing gets crazy real quick. So yeah, it's really not about the transactional question answer. It's about that response. So well said, Brent. We got plenty of stuff to keep us busy tonight. We'll have our rapid fire response section, which when that comes up, if you're a first timer, brace yourself for that segment music because it's a doozy. But I'm going to dive right in. Brent, you got anything else? Let's see. Our next Q&A, actually, we always do that. Our next Q&A is slated for Sunday, March 23rd. And we are going to have L. Grover Fricks on that. I don't even think I'm going to show up that night. I'm not even going to be here. So I introduced Elle like a year ago, almost exactly a year ago. She led a Q&A live stream for us. I introduced her. She's one of the co-teachers, one of the co-hosts, teachers on the Bema teaching team. And we've been storing up questions for her and her specialties. And we're going to let her lead that on March 23rd. That's a Sunday.
Yeah, that was the January 2024 Q&A. So if you want to go back and watch the replay and get introduced to Elle, if you're a first timer, if you're early on the podcast, although if you listen to, is it this week's reboot episode? Or no, this week was it last week? Whatever.
I don't remember.
We're starting to introduce these people early on in the podcast as well. So you'll run into these people, but yeah, we all have our different strengths, and so we have a rotating cast of characters to answer your questions in better ways, hopefully.
Yeah, absolutely. Well, that's what's coming next month and the date. So save it on your calendars. I'm going to jump right in. Start with a question from Lucas. I'm going to summarize some of this. Lucas has a Muslim coworker. They've been having a lot of what sounds like really great, fun conversations, dialogues, all that stuff. He quotes some of the Quran, talks about Muslims' perspectives and what they believe and see about Jesus. And then he says this: why do you believe the strongest support is that the prophesied Messiah is God, or that Jesus himself was saying he was God? The apostles certainly believe it and write it clearly, and there's good historical support of the Gospels. There was the Council of Nicaea. Jesus had a lot of indirect quotes in the Gospels and does some things that only God could do, like forgive sins. I'm hoping you can help me link some terms like Son of God, Messiah, Son of Man. I am the holy name of God, Yod He Vav He, Good Shepherd, truth, light to their Old Testament roots. Or if you could help with some Jewish context on defining divine characteristics that Jesus exhibited in addition to forgiving sins. And just talks about his coworker, dialoguing, engaging with him. They're both searching for truth, which can be found in the person of Jesus. His coworker is a deep thinker and devoted person. It's beautiful. I love the respect you have for your coworker. And that comes out in your question, and that's awesome. And I would just affirm, I'm not going to go much further than you've gone, Lucas, in your question here. I think in a lot of ways, the Christian conversation is rooted, by the way, before we even get started, because somebody's going to get this twisted. I affirm what we would call Orthodox creedal Christianity, what's expressed as Orthodox Christian faith through the ecumenical Christian creeds. Those first, particularly the first four, some people say the first 7 ecumenical councils, the creeds that came out of those. I'm here for all of that. I just think that in a lot of ways, those questions, I don't think any of the answers are wrong. They were just different questions. They were not the same questions that a Jewish audience was asking, that the world of the Bible was asking when the Bible was written. So it kind of feels like sometimes it's hard to put the two together. And so when we ask this question that you're asking, Lucas, we're often letting a systematic theology, a philosophically driven systematic theology that has particular categories and handles and definitions, that ends up kind of driving the conversation, which is in some ways getting the cart before the horse. Now, again, I said at the beginning, I affirm I don't have any beef. I don't have a bone to pick with creedal orthodoxy. I'm fine with all those things. But these are all great questions. Let me go back. Why do you believe the strongest support is that the prophesied Messiah is God? Well, first of all, let's recognize that Jewish thought did not think the Messiah was going to be God. Like those two things did not go together. Christians take that for granted because of who we believe Jesus was. But the Messiah in Jewish thought was a lot of things, could be a lot of things, but one thing the Messiah was never in their mind was God. So this idea that the Messiah, a human character, is also God incarnate is just like this crazy blasphemous idea for both the faith of Islam and Judaism in a lot of ways. Like that's just a crazy, like that's just not, those two categories did not go together. They didn't cross. Or that Jesus himself was saying he was God. And I do think on that answer, that's going to be the answer. Why do I think that Jesus was God, if I could summarize your question that way? Because Jesus seemed to really say that that's the case. Now, when I say that, I am not going to quote all the typical proof texts that we think of, where most Christians say, oh, this is where Jesus claims to be God. Oh, this is where Jesus claims to be God. Most all of those are not the places that I would go, because in a Jewish world and in a Jewish mind, I don't think Jesus is saying those things nearly as directly. However, there are all kinds of places that the typical Christian mind doesn't catch where Jesus really is saying those things. One book I would recommend is a book by Jacob Neusner titled A Rabbi Talks with Jesus. I'm pretty sure A Rabbi Has a Conversation. No, A Rabbi Talks with Jesus by Jacob Neusner. And in that book, Neusner says, I want to show you why, if I were a Jewish rabbi, if I was who I was today, having a conversation with Jesus in the second, temple period, this is the conversation I would have. And at the end of this conversation, I'm going to squarely, he's not trying to be provocative. He says, I'm going to reject Jesus, and the Christian's going to accept him even more. And the reason behind that book, the basic line of thought at the end of almost every chapter, is Jesus is claiming something in the middle of a very mainline Jewish conversation that you cannot claim. It's reserved for two things: Torah and God. And just chapter after chapter, Jesus is saying, I am. He's not saying, look to Torah. He says, look to me. He doesn't say, you'll find this in Torah, you'll find this in God. He says, you'll find this in me. And those connections where Jesus self-identifies with the source of wisdom, the source of rest, the source of salvation, the source of forgiveness. Now, again, I think when we have this conversation, we're usually so wound up about theological categories that the whole thing just looks blurry, and I just don't like how the conversation goes. There's a better way to have these conversations, where what we see Jesus saying is, we have always yoked ourselves to wisdom. We've always yoked ourselves to the law, to Torah, to Moses. We've yoked ourselves to God. We've yoked ourselves, Jesus says, yoke yourself to me. And then backs that up with the authority of his teaching, with the brilliance of his wisdom, with the blameless righteousness of his life, in ways that we just haven't seen even in a character like Moses. I say that as a Jewish believer. So when you put all those things together, but words like the Son of God can be used in a million different ways in Jewish thought. It doesn't mean he's claiming to be God. Son of God can mean a lot of things. Messiah in Jewish thought wasn't God. Son of Man, he used a lot of things. So it's the way that Jesus connects these dots and then self-identifies as the very point and all that stuff. And I will close by saying what you also point out. The apostles certainly believe this. And I believe in the inspiration of all the scripture, and in that I include the New Testament. So all of those apostolic letters, I believe, are authoritative and inspired and God-breathed. So the apostles, these earliest believers, these earliest apostolic believers. So these early apostolic believers believed quite clearly in this thing we're talking about, that the fullness of God was pleased to dwell in Christ. We can argue a lot about what those words are, but there's something there about what the early apostolic community believed and affirmed in those earliest inspired writings. And then, obviously, the writings that follow, and then a more Western philosophical expression in the creeds. So I'm good with those ideas. I just hate the way that we stack the deck when we're having those conversations. And if I'm discussing that with, in your case, a Muslim coworker, or in my case, a fellow Jewish, a fellow Jew, brother or sister, that's not a helpful way to start the conversation, to frame the conversation. It's not what I want the center of gravity. I want the center of gravity to be Jesus, not a doctrine about Jesus. I want it to be the person of Jesus. I want the conversation to be not about theology, because that's exactly how everyone wants to deflect this conversation. We want to talk about the divinity of Jesus. Okay, I want to talk about the person of Jesus. And we'll encounter divinity. Like we'll bump into the theology along the way. Like that will find its way into the conversation. But I certainly don't want to anchor the conversation there. I don't want to start there. And it's such a good question. It's such a good question. But those are just some of my thoughts. I think the Western way we frame it can be unhelpful. But I affirm all of it. Lori says this. Lori says, what is the birthright that Esau gave to his brother? What is the difference between that birthright and the blessing that Jacob stole? Or was the birthright that was given up allowed for the stolen blessings? So yeah, you'd have two elements at play in the common ancient Israelite Hebraic experience. You're going to have a birthright. What is the birthright? The birthright is that the order of the sons. So if a father has 3 sons, and in their world it ended up being patriarchal, we can even argue whether it was supposed to be gender-based or not, but in their world it's gender-based. So you have sons, you have 3 sons, you're going to split your estate 4 ways. And the Behor, the firstborn, Behor is what the word is in Hebrew, the Behor gets a double portion. So if you have 7 sons, you're going to split the estate 8 ways, and the firstborn gets a double portion. If you have 2 sons, like the prodigal son story, you're going to split your estate 3 ways, and the oldest son gets a double portion. The oldest son always gets a double portion of the father's estate. That's your birthright. It's a right to inheritance. It's also a lot more than just the material expression, but the material expression is often what's driving that conversation. So essentially, when Esau sells his birthright, he essentially says, even though you're not the firstborn, I'm selling my claim to dad's inheritance. That's what he's essentially selling. Then you have this other thing that's a little bit more poetic. They wouldn't have said it was a toss away. They believed blessings were unbelievably efficacious. But then there's a blessing. There's a thing that Father gives me, that my Father blesses me with. It sets the course of my identity and who I am and what's going to happen in the future. It's this prayerful pronouncement of who I am and who God is and how those things are going to collide in my life. And those are 2 separate things. And Jacob gets in there and steals, or that might not be the word that you wanted to use, but whatever. He gets in and usurps both of those things that are a part of Esau's journey and takes them onto his own journey. So that's the birthright and the blessing. Live question from YouTube. Now seeing Esau as a forgiving brother, why would Jesus be a descendant of Jacob and of Judah, the brother who wanted to kill Joseph? So the descendants, why would Jesus be a descendant of Jacob? I mean, he is a descendant of Jacob. I don't know if I understand that. I'm probably not reading that question right. Dylan, sorry about that. So Esau's descendants would be Edomites. So Jesus then in that case isn't an Edomite. He's a Jew descendant. And he's trying to make this point. Like, that's spoiler alert for anybody who's not in session 3. That's the point of the prodigal son story, right? This is actually the point that Jesus is trying to pull out, right, Dylan? Like, Jesus is trying to say, like, even Esau, the guy who's not a part of our blessed inheritance and our blessed lineage, even the brother that even he understands how to forgive, how to restore, how to redeem outsiders. Like, even like the whole story of the prodigal son is a condemnation of the Pharisees because they're supposed to be Esau. So there's no condemnation of Esau. In fact, Esau's actually the hero in that story, right? So Jesus ends up spinning that. And so Jesus, a descendant of Jacob, because he's a Jew, is trying to get them to reframe their story and get them to see that what God's expecting of them, inviting them to do, encouraging them to be a part of, is being willing to not have to be the chosen hero, but to do what Jesus does, to lay their life down, to empty themselves, to not consider their birthright or their special place or their lineage tied to Jacob, to let those things go and consider others more important than themselves, because Esau did that. And if Esau can do that, how much more should the descendants of God's family do that? And then the second part of your question, Dylan, and of Judah, the brother who wanted to kill Joseph. Right. But, and I think Dylan's baiting me, I think, because Dylan's been around this block a couple times. But that's the whole point of that story, right? Is because Judah does what Esau does. Judah's willing to admit he's willing to confess publicly in front of everybody else his own lack of righteousness and the injustice and the mistreatment of Tamar. And because of that, Judah ends up being changed. So yes, Judah was the one who wanted to kill Joseph, but then Judah becomes the one who saves the whole family. The whole family gets saved because Judah's willing to humble himself, to confess and to repent. And because of that, he will provoke. Joseph is not the hero of the Joseph story. Joseph, we're going to try to make this clear in the reboot, by the way. Joseph is not the hero of the Joseph story. Judah is. Judah is the hero of the Joseph story. That's why Messiah comes from the tribe of Judah. That's why the king of Israel comes from the tribe of Judah, not the tribe of Joseph or Manasseh or Ephraim. It comes from the tribe of Judah, because Judah is the one that was the catalyst for, that opened the door for redemption, forgiveness, confession, repentance, because he was humble. And that's what makes him a king. Not his strength, not his righteousness, not his humility and willingness to die to himself, which feels very Jesus-y. So there you go. And Esau, you could say, Dylan, you're right on. Esau did it first. And you wouldn't be wrong. And I think Jesus highlights that in that prodigal son story. Laura says this: I'm curious as to thoughts from Marty or the team. You're stuck with me, Laura, unless Brent wants to jump in here and interrupt me, on the appointment of deacons in Acts being a man-made appointment versus a God-ordained appointment, and any repercussions that may have come as a result of the disciples not acting like their rabbi by feeding the widows themselves and feeling above table service, which Jesus did continuously. First of all, Laura, let me just honor your question. I love your heart behind this. I love what you're driving at, and I love what you're wanting to see. Now, let's step back and re-examine some of those things. Jesus did not feed every widow he walked by. Jesus didn't heal every person that was in his vicinity. Jesus didn't, because that's not what Jesus was up to, or what Jesus was necessarily attempting to do. Fix every material situation. He was trying to teach us how to be the people, and that gets to the heart of your question. The heart of your question is, are they not being the people that God asked them to be, because they're not taking care of the widows themselves? And what we have here is this is exactly what the Jewish tradition would do. The apostles are, here's a question, here's a story we could go to. Here's an example. Moses is in the wilderness, and Moses thinks that it's his job to do everything. And Jethro comes to him and says, what are you doing? You have 2.6 million, 4.6 million people in the desert, or 700,000, however you want to do the math, doesn't matter. You have all these people and you're going to be the only judge? This is crazy and ridiculous. You need to split this up. You need to come up with a system. Did God come up with that system? No, it's not a God-ordained system. But God expects us to steward the mission in a way. Like we're supposed to go, okay, God's given us, not just me, God's given us together corporately a job to do, and we have to figure out how to do this together. And some of those outworkings of that mission that God's given us will take the shape of, oh, I hate this word, programs, infrastructure, the way that we'll order ourselves. And those things will never be where the magic is. It'll just be ways in which we can get the magic done, because we're all called to take care of. But the thing that's happening in Acts is they're like, and I know it'd be easy to throw stones at their language. They're like, we need to be left to the teaching. But what they're really saying is this task that we have in front of us, the people that are in need are far bigger than the apostolic leadership can take care of on their own. And so they appoint deacons. And the word deacon, it just means servant. Like that's like, we could just translate the word deacon as servant. That's what the word deacon means. They just found some people that wanted to engage in servant leadership. It becomes a big church office later, and not a whole lot later, but a little bit later in church history. All of a sudden, deacon, capital D, deaconess, like you have an office, a role that's more a title. I mean, it happens later in history, but when this is put in place, this is just people that they've appointed to serve and to take care of those they're in. It's a very justice-oriented thing for them to do. And there's a lot of stuff that God expects from us, and he doesn't tell us how to do it. There's a lot of things that God expects from us. He doesn't ordain the how to get that done. I don't think there's any fault in Acts. That's my opinion. You could disagree with me, Laura. You could. But I don't think there's any. I think what we see in Acts is beautiful. And a pure impulse that is not lacking in righteousness in any way. I don't think it's necessarily the only way they could have answered that question. It was the way that they chose to answer that question in their moment. We're going to have to do the same things in our world, right? We got to figure out how we're going to do the same stuff. How are we going to meet the needs of this group of people? And we don't just say, well, it's the pastor's job, or it's the leader's job, or it's all of our jobs to do it. How will we order ourselves in such a way that we can get that thing done, and we can get it done the most effectively? I don't even want to say the most efficiently, because it's not efficiency and Western values that are driving this, but effectively and in a way that accomplishes the purposes of God. Yeah. So that's what I see there, as I see something that's very rooted in a long history of God's people saying, how are we going to order ourselves? The Sanhedrin. Tribal leaders, clans, judges in the book of Judges. Eventually kings, and we can throw plenty of stones at kings and the monarchy and all that. Prophets, the priestly order, how they choose to do that. There are some things that are God ordained, and then there are a lot of instructions that God says, this is what you need to do, and then we have to figure out how we're going to do that. So in Sukkot, God says, I need you to bring a myrtle branch, a willow branch, a palm frond, and a citrus fruit to the temple. It doesn't say what to do with it. That's where the command ends, right? And we could say that, like, well, we're just supposed to bring these things to the temple because that's all that God ordained. Or we would say, well, God expects us to do something with these, and he's left that up to us. And so they make what they call the lulav, which is what the scripture calls the thing that they will celebrate, worship, and shake at the temple when they celebrate during the festival of Sukkot, with boughs in hand, Psalm 118 says. Go up and join the festal procession to the altar. But God didn't tell them what to do with all those things. They figured out what to do with all those things together. So that's one way to look at it. But that's a good question, Laura. It's a good question. And certainly not one that is, we can't look at what Marty just said and be like, and that solves it. Thanks for writing in. Nope, there'd be other ways to see that. And I appreciate the critical thought and the way that we're willing to think critically about who we are and what we do. Oh, Lions 8804 from Twitter. Are we getting comments from Twitter, Brent? That wasn't a thing. Is it a thing now? Where are you, Brent?
There he is. We have always been able to get the comments from Twitter. We cannot send comments back to Twitter. So when I put a link in the chat, they don't get it, unfortunately.
Okay. Well, here I go then.
All right.
Thanks, Lions8804. Have you heard Shane Wood, Ozark U at Ozark University on Revelation? He goes into more detail than Bema on Revelation, but asks many of the same questions and diverges as much from Left Behind theology as you all do. But I think he's a good reference for it. Yeah, Shane Wood's a great reference. And I met Shane after we recorded the Revelation series. And when we get to that spot in the reboot, I will throw him as a Revelation resource in there. We overlap in a lot of ways. And he's probably one of those better known Revelation experts when it comes to the historical hermeneutic that we use. I spoke with Shane. We were the two keynote speakers at the Michigan Christian Convention in 2021, 22. Michigan Christian Convention. We spoke together, and he and I were those two main speakers. So I got to know Shane and hear Shane, and we have a lot of overlap in a lot of things when it comes to theology and hermeneutic and heart. And so really enjoyed getting to know Shane. Shane's a great resource. So absolutely. Let's see here. Paul says, I've been looking into how Herod the Great was appointed king of the Jews. I'm struggling to find references to how the priests who appointed or selected Herod to be king. I have an extensive library through Logos and haven't found any references to Herod the Great being appointed by the priests, the Hasmoneans. I have asked AI these questions. Well, how can I compete with ChatGPT? I have the Babylonian and Jewish Talmud that would have been included in the search. Basically, can you give me the references to support the claim? So that's just Josephus, your main source of history. Like everything about the Hasmonean dynasty that we know in history, your primary source for everything Herodian, everything Hasmonean, everything Zealot, almost all of that comes from Josephus. So the complete works of Josephus is what you're looking for there. You're going to have all kinds of other offshoot historians that are going to basically riff off of that and other history, folks like Eusebius or different things like that. But Josephus is going to be your primary source. Now, some of the problem you're having, Paul, is just issues of language. The priests have no interest in making anybody king of the Jews. That's not at all how they want that to work at all. That arrangement was with Caesar. Herod's agreement and arrangement was what was being put together under Julius Caesar. And then there's that battle at Julius's assassination. There's a battle of the throne between Octavian and Mark Antony. Herod the Great sides with Mark Antony, and then Caesar Augustus, ends up taking the throne. Herod the Great then goes and petitions to Augustus, and as history is told, basically has a quote that says, "Don't judge me by who I chose to be my friends, but how fiercely loyal I was to those friendships, because now I'm asking to be your friend." And Caesar Augustus is the one that pronounces him king over Judea. King of the Jews is more of a pejorative imperial jab that gets made at the crucifixion. And people would have probably used the phrase all the time, king of the Jews, because he's the king of Judea. So he's the regional governor over the entire province of Judea and Samaria. I believe he was governor over that whole region. Eventually, he ends up giving that on his death. He'll give that to his 3 sons. But the answer to your question is it's actually Rome that makes him. The priests don't do that. The priests have no authority to do that. That's not a priestly decision. That's a Roman decision. And Herod the Great petitions Caesar Augustus for that. That should not be hard to find on ChatGPT, Google, or any of those things. Logos, I'm not sure if Logos has the complete works of Josephus. I'm not familiar with that software enough to know whether or not Josephus is included in Logos. I would imagine it does. Logos has like everything under the sun. But that would be your source there is is the complete works of Josephus, which I've read from cover to cover, and I can definitely say it's in there. And Josephus is mainly your main. Anything in that period of time related to Second Temple Judaism, Josephus is going to be your starting place and your primary source for almost all history. So that's in there. A lot of it's just our algorithms, our search engine algorithms, the way we phrase something, all that kind of stuff. So, and a lot of times the way that we phrase it in Bema could be phrased better from a historical perspective if I was doing the work of history, but I'm doing the work of scriptural narrative. So I'm shaping those lessons. I'm bending that language to those ends because I'm not trying to do the work of history. I'm trying to do the work of historically informed theology. And so sometimes the way that I phrase it is not a great way to find what you're looking for when you go searching. So that's that, Paul. Hopefully that's somewhat helpful. And by the way, your main Herodian scholar, like if you want to get real crazy about Herod, Ehud Netzer actually died while he was doing excavations. He fell from the platform. If you go to the Herodium today, there's the theater that they've excavated. They were excavating that theater. They had just found it. There was a makeshift platform that the team the dig was using up above. He was leaning against the rail. The rail gave way. He fell backwards and fell to his death. Ehud Netzer was the preeminent scholar for Herod the Great and his sons, the Herodian dynasty. And he made a lot of claims before he died that have been proven to be true. He was good. He was very, very good at his job. So there you go. Ehud Netzer. Doreen, live comment from Facebook. In Josh's debut episode, he said that Moses checked out after God told him he wasn't going to go to the promised land. Bible Project just did a series on the theme of the mountain, and their take on Elijah's second mountain story is that it's his failure because God is telling him to find his replacements since Elijah, doesn't want to listen to God's direction. That idea I can get behind, and I think that's when he checked out because God told Elijah to anoint 3 people, but he only anoints Elisha. It's Elisha who anoints the other 2 that Elijah was supposed to anoint. I can absolutely see reading it that way. That seems exactly what the text tells us. With those 2 stories in mind, what would you hypothesize could have been Jesus's moment, where he could have fallen into the temptation of checking out? I mean, the temptation is going to be to tie everything to the story of the temptation, right? And those 3, and you could easily make that case. That wouldn't be hard at all to say, well, it was in the temptation, the second or the third temptation, depending on which gospel you're wanting to use. It's that temptation where he basically is tempted with maybe some of those same things. I would say at any point along Jesus's journey, so many places, especially in the Gospel of John, where he feeds the 5,000 and then they try to make him king. And he says, eat my flesh and drink my blood. And everybody leaves him. And he says to the disciples, you're going to leave too? And they're like, where else would we go? You have the words of eternal life. There are these moments that for me would be key moments. Who knows about whether or not they're key for Jesus? But I think this is what potentially is awesome about the idea of the faithfulness of Jesus. A lot of times when you're reading your New Testament, there will be this idea to have faith in Jesus. Faith in Jesus, which is a theological construct, and some scholars have pointed out doesn't make any sense to read it that way. That wouldn't mean anything for another 150, 200 years. Faith in Jesus doesn't mean anything to them, which sounds ridiculous, but then when you start to think about it, you're like, oh yeah, that makes total sense. But you can read, the phrase in the Greek is pistis Christou, and you can say faith in Jesus, but you can also say faith of Jesus or the faithfulness of Jesus. And I love thinking about the faithfulness of Jesus in reference to a question like this. When could we hypothesize that Jesus's moment when he could have fallen into temptation of checking out? Man, maybe 100 times a day. Who knows what it was like to walk in his shoes? And yet what he did was he didn't check out. the faithfulness of Jesus was a faithfulness that kept saying, I'm going to let you define the story. I'm going to let you give the direction. I'm going to live on every word. And now I'm back to the temptation story. Maybe that's just our best landing spot. But I think it's bigger than that. I think there are so many moments where for Jesus, he could have checked out. What we have with Moses and Elijah, is we have actual stories where like, ooh, there's a checkout moment there. And I like that. Yeah, thanks for bringing the Bible Project stuff in there. Never a bad decision to hang out with the Bible Project. Let's see here. Jake, I was listening to episode 122 on naked thing or a thing of nakedness. Rvat davar or davar rvat. One of those doesn't need to have the T because it's in shmichut form. Thanks, L. Which seems to be the only one that you've done on divorce. I've touched on it a couple times, but that was the exclusive episode on divorce. You glossed over the part about sexual infidelity and said it was all about protecting the women. I mean, Jake, to be more fair to me, I'm not sure I glossed over it. It was the central part to the argument, right? So Hillel said, if she burns your biscuits, it's a naked thing, any old thing, right? And then Shammai said it was a thing of nakedness, which we clearly spent a whole bunch of time talking about. That thing of nakedness would be an issue of sexual infidelity. So that's the whole crux of the argument that we were talking about was sexual infidelity. To which Jesus sides with that Shammai ruling of sexual infidelity. The point of the lesson, which you heard, which I wouldn't want any of us to miss, is that Jesus is not making it about the ethical code. He's saying there's something else that we're doing. We're having this conversation, and there's a whole group of people that are getting run over. So I'll get to your question, but hold on, because right now we're doing the very thing that Jesus is getting after them for doing, right? So just, I'll answer the question, but pause, because Jesus says you're not seeing people, you're seeing rules. You're not seeing people, you're seeing situations. You're not seeing people, you're seeing a code of ethics. You're not seeing people, you're trying to figure out when it's okay to justify. And he says, see the people. And in their case, it's definitely that female situation. It's the women that are getting run over by the system that they're in. Now, behind that, I think, Jake, in your question, there's this question behind the question, right? There's this, because we all have like all these other crazy stories. Maybe in our world, maybe in I don't even know what your story is, Jake. Maybe in your situation, you've experienced the flip-flop, right? And so sometimes that's the question behind the question behind the question. But before we get there and make it about ethics and codes, we'll pause and say it's about people, because somebody's getting abused, right? The thing that really gets God about divorce is not when you're divorcing for illegitimate or legitimate reasons. It's that somebody's getting abused in the process. That's what, like that. So that's what he gets. Okay, so let's go back to your question. I'm just curious what the correct biblical interpretation would be in the case of the woman leaving or cheating. That's not hard, like that's right there in the New Testament. You have to go to Paul to do that. Jesus doesn't engage that, but Paul makes it really clear. Takes the same line of thinking that Jesus used. If the woman has an adulterous relationship, if the man has an adulterous relationship, if there's sexual infidelity, or Paul says relatively clearly, as clearly as something can be, if there's a desertion element, then he says these kind of situations are where we find divorce being applicable, right? And again, you'll notice how hard I work to avoid a conversation where what we're saying is, oh, this is where divorce is okay, and this is where divorce isn't okay. That's the wrong conversation to have, because it's about restoration. It's about people. And even if there is infidelity, how many times have we seen those redemption stories? I'm not saying that anybody owes that to anybody. I'm not saying, But on the flip side, we don't want to say, oh, this is transactionally how divorce works. Jesus' whole point in his teaching is, listen, there are some realities out there that make divorce a real experienced reality in our world, for sure, 110%. But don't forget that it's about people, and it's about who's getting trampled in that process. So always keep that out in front of us, right? So that's some of those things. It's a really good question. And yes, to be more direct about your question, Jake, yes, Jesus takes the line of thinking that if there's sexual infidelity, divorce is an option. It's a biblically ordained option before you. Yes, Jesus and Paul and the apostolic community say, if there's desertion, you're free to see divorce as an applicable option. There, those are applicable option. It's just such an uncompelling. This is check. This is like, there's just, and what Jesus is doing is he's saying there's more. See this differently. All right. Brent had a whole bunch of stuff we put in. Oh, there it is. Let's see here. Caleb says, reminds me of the Bema liturgy reading this past weekend of the minimums of the law and Christ turning it into the maximums. Yeah, which is a Lois Twerberg reference. Yeah, and that's a great connection, Caleb. Yeah, absolutely. So again, I'm not trying to say, no, Jake, no, it's not that. I'm not trying to say that. I'm trying to say Jesus is trying to change the conversation to something else. There are applicable ways that the code is relevant, but Jesus is also quite adamant, like the ethics code only exists because of our hard hearts and our sinful ways. And it always frustrates me that the church, people in the church, always try to figure out like which categories divorce fits in and how it's right and when it's okay and when it's not okay. And the whole time, people, the whole time there's people involved. Souls, hearts, children, families, people, not, and I know, and don't mishear me, Jake. It's a beautiful question. So I don't want you to have to write an email and be like, I wasn't trying to say it wasn't about people. Like I totally hear you there. I don't hear that in your question, but I think that's why I think you expressed, Jake, what a lot of other people have expressed, which is, I just want you to tell me this about divorce and quit dodging the issue and blah, 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 blah. And I think in your question, you're experiencing some of those same things. And I'm trying to be committed to like, I want to reframe it because Jesus reframed it. Jesus had two options. Jesus had the two options that you have in front of you that you're asking about. And they had those, and they had this guy that said this and this guy that said this. And Jesus sided with one of the guys, kind of, and said the whole thing misses the point. Do this instead, which is exactly what I'm trying to do. I'm just not doing it as good as Jesus. But there's this and there's this. And Jesus says this, but not really. So you ask me this or this, and I'm going to tell you this. Yeah. But this. If you need an answer, this. Yeah. But the kingdom of God's like doing something more than that. So we can start here, but let's go somewhere else. Let's do something else. Let's have a different conversation about those things. Last one before our special segment. Another live question from Roshan. Do you believe the seventh-day Sabbath should be kept? We have this question coming up later, too. Friday sunset to Saturday sunset. If you're a Jew, yeah. If you're a Torah observant Jew, that's how Jewish Torah observance defines Sabbath, especially in the fact the Sabbath was created prior to the fall. I do believe in a universal Sabbath. I do believe that there is a Sabbath for all of creation, that creation precedes the fall. Creation and the Sabbath precedes a Jewish covenant. Any covenant, Sabbath and precedes anything. So I think that the principle of Sabbath is true for all of creation. What I have a harder time doing, having been taught to read my Bible through the lens of the incarnation, to see Jesus as the fulfillment of, this is what Tanakh is, this is how to interpret it correctly. I have a hard time then saying Sabbath is about some mechanical observance. Sabbath is about this, from this time to this time. Like that whole thing, if that's the covenant I belong to, I'm a Torah observant Jew. So yes, for me, we light our candles Friday night, 18 minutes before sundown. That's when we observe Sabbath. Sabbath is done 18 minutes after sundown, Saturday night. That's our Sabbath. Because I'm under that particular covenant as a member of the Jewish community to observe that Sabbath. But that Genesis Sabbath has a different relationship to a covenantal expression. It's about all creation. So I believe all creation should. It would go well for us if all creation would honor Sabbath rhythms. I don't think a non-Jewish person should observe a Jewish Sabbath. But I think that all creation should observe the magic, the beauty, the reality of Sabbath. I just wouldn't define it the same way. So if a Gentile brother or a sister came and said, well, we Sabbath on Sunday for these reasons, okay, cool. As a Torah observant Jew, I won't, but it's cool. If somebody says, well, here's my life situation, I want to honor Sabbath, but I'm going to honor it with all my heart, soul, and might on Thursday. Okay. It's sticky. I get it. It's a little messy. I understand. But if that's what a person can do, okay. I think that what we see in Jesus is just grace upon grace, invitation to follow. Yeah, and I appreciate the comments that were, and I'm not going to get into a back and forth proof texting debate on my live stream. So yeah, where do you get the sun up and sundown from in Scripture? Like as far as a definition of when Sabbath is, that's how a Jewish day is observed, and yeah, that's how a Jewish day is observed, from evening till morning. We're still projecting into that's how we're supposed to. These are all expressions of a covenantal relationship with God, right? So there's a whole lot of things in Sabbath observance that show up in a Levitical code. In the and I'm not a Hebrew roots guy. I know we have lots of Hebrew roots people that like bump into my stuff. Not me. It's not me. I do not believe Gentiles are supposed to play Judaism. I don't. And that will just be a hard line for me. That's a hard line for me. It's not what we're doing at Bema. It's not. It's deeply offensive the way it appropriates Judaism. So it's deeply offensive to our Jewish brothers and sisters. It's not what Paul invites us into in a New Testament gospel-centered community, which had a Jewish expression which would have honored those Saturday, Friday sundown to Saturday sundown type expressions and commitments for sure. And then, we can all let the scholars argue about how early does the Christian community start. I mean, this early Christian community is a community that finds its identity in a Jewish community. It's a part of a larger Jewish movement, and then finds are they meeting at synagogue on Saturday with their Jewish community, and then finding are they also meeting on Sundays as a Christian community? I don't know. I don't typically see it that way. It doesn't sound like, Rashawn, you probably do either. But a lot of people have made that case. A lot of things we don't know for sure. Was that okay? Was it not okay? When I meet the Yeah, this whole thing just spins out in some crazy ways. When I meet the single mom who works 2 jobs in an inner city urban situation, and she struggles to find the way and the ability to honor a Sabbath, and she wants to honor it on a Thursday because that's what her life allows her to do. Yeah, I think Jesus smiles at that. I think Jesus smiles at that. That's my personal opinion. I think that's the Jesus that we find all throughout the pages of Scripture. I don't think he looks at the calendar and goes, well, it's really not real. I think he goes, I see this Gentile trying to honor this Sabbath expression. That's just what yeah. Yeah, appreciate that. I see your comment there, Rashawn, later, that you say don't mean to bicker. Just want to understand your perspective. Yeah. Yep, and we got another question coming down below, and I get that a lot. Like, I always get cornered. So I appreciate that. I actually appreciate that last statement, Rashawn, quite a bit. Like, I get cornered a lot by Seventh-day folks, by whatever, and they're just like, they're super adamant, like, this is the only way to see it, and that's cool. More power to you. It's just not what I see Jesus inviting. Like, we have these groups in the Gospels, Pharisees, Sadducees, Zealots, Herodians. We got Jesus and his disciples and this crazy Havurah. And that kind of approach definitely feels like one of those groups to me. And it's the group that Jesus keeps trying to say, like, man, you guys are missing the party and you're missing the point. That's just me. That's just how I engage that. So, but lots and lots of people disagree. Lots of people do. Yeah. Roshan says I'm a Seventh-day. You're SDA. Totally. Yeah, and I got lots of respect for that, and I have lots of respect for a movement that wants to honor a biblical Sabbath. So, and we got lots of SDA listeners, and I totally get that because we're big Sabbath people. And at the end of the day, the expression is a little bit different for me, but I get that. I get it. Beautiful. All right, Brent. I'm a little late, but it's time. Play the music. For all of our first timers, there you go, everybody. Rapid fire responses. This is a special segment where I take questions and answer them rapidly. So here we go. Zach says, does Bema have any good book recommendations about how to practice shalom in our modern day? Zach, I wish I could have you like rephrase that, because I bet you're looking for something or asking for something, but the word shalom is like one of the most all-encompassing words you could possibly use. So like shalom, have any book recommendations about how to practice shalom? Everything from spiritual formation to biblical justice to basically everything we've ever recommended. So my quick rapid fire response would be, do I have any book recommendations for how to practice shalom in our modern day? I would say go to bemadiscipleship.com/resources and start at the top of that list. Because one of the first things we'll talk about, Roshan, is going to be Sabbath. You want to talk about Sabbath? Sabbath would be a great way to, practice shalom in our modern day. Walter Brueggemann's going to say one of the most central things you can do. This isn't very rapid fire. Kendra said, I just finished episode 303 in session 6, Book of John in 1989. I took a class in Bible college called Messiah and the Law and Prophets. His teacher was a Jewish believer named Jeff Seif, and he published a little book called The House That God Built. From what I remember, that book centered around parallels between the furnishings of the tabernacle and the Book of John. His theory is that the structure of the Book of John mirrors the construction of the tabernacle, Jesus saying that he's the bread of life in reference to the table of showbread, saying he's the light of the world in reference to the menorah, right up to the time the veil was torn in two. Have y'all ever heard of that theory? Have any thoughts? I have some thoughts. I've heard of that theory. Somebody get Benjamin Casperson on the phone, because he loves this theory that John is mirroring temple talk, tabernacle talk. Yeah, absolutely. And I'm starting to be sold that that's going on. So yes, I'm not going to dive in deep, but I'm just going to say a hearty, yeah, that's awesome, Kendra. Nailed it. Pat says this, I'm radically changed by this work. Radically. It's no accident that I came to this point today. In light of our current political empire, I feel truly empowered with the knowledge about how to handle it. Live as much as possible as the questions. Live in the kingdom of shalom. Care for people. If it's not about that, it's not about God, period. Looking at what is mine to do today. No matter what your work is today for Bema, you are making a difference. Thank you from the bottom of my heart. I threw this in here on purpose, Pat, because Pat, your email represents like 1 million emails, 100 emails that we got in the last 2 or 3 months saying thank you, expressing. So I just say to you, I just say thank you for sending those words of encouragement in on days where you will forget 100 of those emails, and you will think on the one email that's like, you guys suck, and here's what you do wrong. And so I just wanted to say thank you. Thank you for sending that in. That's awesome. And thank you. Those words of encouragement are something we try not to forget, even though it's easy to do. Zach says, I'm going through season 3 in the Beatitudes of Matthew. I'm not as educated in the history of the different groups, Pharisees, Zealots, Essenes, etc. But I was reading where you mentioned how groups from all different cities and regions came to listen to Jesus and how the disciples were probably nervous. Then Jesus immediately begins to teach his disciples the Beatitudes. I couldn't help wondering if each Beatitude expresses a different one of those groups present. I don't know how many of those groups would have been there, just a thought that I figured would have been better. First of all, Zach, in a large way, on a large poetic level, I'm just going to say yes, 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 yes. I will also think back to, like, if you're a Chosen fan, was it the end of season 2 where Jesus ends with the Beatitudes and he writes the Beatitudes? It's like one of my all-time favorite moments of everything the Chosen has done up to this point. Like, that was so, and he's essentially writing the Beatitudes about that. Just a beautiful expression of that. Now, can we say that's exactly what's happening from a literary perspective in the Beatitudes? That's what Matthew is doing. That's what Jesus is doing, however you want to word that. Like, can we say that? I'm going to stop a little short of that and say, be careful about how far we go about what Jesus is for sure saying, but I don't think this is a crazy idea at all. Rachel says, I hope you're well. Thanks, Rachel. I am well. I mean, I've had better weeks. I've had better months, but I'm doing okay. Thanks. I've been exposed to this idea that when Noah cursed Ham, that meant that Africa was cursed. Do you believe that to be true? I would love your honest opinion. Here is my honest opinion. Are you ready? No. I think, I'm going to try to make this rapid. I think that teaching, which you are not claiming at all, you have heard it. So I am not sending this back at you, Rachel. You wanted my honest opinion about this idea you've heard. I think that is some dangerous, racist, really, really bad, destructive stuff. That's my honest opinion about that. And it gets spun out into some crazy, crazy ways. So no, that is not the curse of Ham. That is a crazy white supremacist doctrinal rooted teaching. Okay, that's my honest opinion. Blake says, I'm a listener to the show, really been studying the story of David and Goliath with a group of workout guys. You mentioned on the podcast that Ray's teaching on David and Goliath has influenced your understanding, particularly on the idea of throw your stone, which has kind of been a tagline with our group. I can't find any of Ray's teachings on the subject online. Do you have access to some of Ray's teaching or any others that you have? I have access to all kinds of Ray's teaching that are all like personal recordings from when I was with Ray. That's where I thought that he had done that online more than he has. Now, I went searching rapid fire response for you, Blake, and this is volume 1 of the original DVD series. They're changing how they distribute his teaching. So all this stuff is changing. But if you could get access to the original volume 1 of That the World May Know, this is volume 1. That means it's the dry stuff from when Ray was like super young, like 40 years ago, 30 years ago. I don't even know. But he is like, look at that guy on there is no gray hair in that guy's head. I did not know that guy. I was but a child, a babe when this was being recorded. But the last lesson on this volume 1, Promised Land, the last lesson is Iron of Culture. And that is going to be what you're looking for if you want the video. If you want I'm going to have 1995, Brent just said. I was 13 years old. 13. Not quite as little of a kid as I thought I was, but I digress. Brent is also going to put a link in the chat of the written version of that same faith lesson. So there is a lesson on his site that is the same thing. You'll notice it's not the same. I definitely got my lesson from Ray. Don't misunderstand me. I do something a little different than Ray does in that in the faith lesson you will see on here and the faith lesson that you will see in that article, I do something different for sure. I take it a little bit different. I shape it differently. I think Ray does today too, but I digress. Katie says, I am a forever Bible student, and I'm going to be teaching on the books of 1st and 2nd Peter in a YWAM Bible school. I'm wondering if you have any recommended resources for the early church and the books of Peter in particular. I haven't made it into the church section of the podcast yet. Currently, I'm on session 4. Short answer, Katie, rapid fire is no. I don't have any great resources on. I have a few books in my library I have not read yet. I would not say my expectation level is high. I will say this. I took a Bible hermeneutics course at Xavier doing my grad work, and we had to work with the Fortress commentary on the New Testament. I'm sure Brent will find a link and put it in the show notes. The Fortress New Testament commentary, something like that. And it has great scholarship in there, and it'll have some great stuff on 1st and 2nd Peter. It'll be great. I would recommend that source. I had to use it for my class, and it is awesome. Jim says, I'm here in New Zealand and started a group study last year, which has been exciting and hard at the same time. With this study group, I have used a lot of Jewish resources, and Jewish resources aren't very positive in their reflection of Jesus. Are there any Jewish resources like Bema or Ray Vanderlaan that open up the New Testament based on a reflection and insight of the Old Testament? We share a ton of resources as we go along in the Bema journey, but some that I would highlight for a Jewish perspective would be Lois Tuerberg. I'm definitely going to put Lois Tuerberg on that list as a place to start for sure. I'm going to say things like, we talk about Aleph Beta, Rabbi David Foreman. He's not a believer in Jesus. Okay. He's not a believer in Jesus. You're getting a pure Jewish perspective. But especially of recent, I've heard far less negativity about a Christian worldview. He's not going to talk about Jesus at all, period. But I don't have some of that same reaction to that. Obviously, your Bible projects, it's not necessarily Jewish, but it's good historical content. I feel like there was something I thought of, and it's just escaped my mind. But I always recommend Lois Tuerberg. You've already got Ray Vanderlaan. I feel like there's something I'm totally forgetting, and I can't remember. But I digress. But we're always linking great sources, so pay attention to those show notes and the parts that you're like, I want to go deeper here, I want to go deeper there. And yeah, when you get to the New Testament, all roads start to diverge. So it's like, you want to go down this path, this path, this path. And there's so many different scholars that can help you get where you're trying to go. It just kind of depends on what you're looking for. That was the rapid fire response section. Brent, cue the music. Rapid fire responses. That was our rapid fire responses. Brent Billings, we're here for our station identification.
Yes, we are a part of a larger ministry, actually, and it's exciting. Marty, I've added a whole bunch of stuff that you don't have any context for, so I think you should take this part, and then I will throw all that other stuff.
Okay, I love that. Okay, here we go. The stuff you put in here, like from Betty?
Yeah, I'll do all that.
Betty you're going to do all that?
Well, yeah, I thought you would do the this.
I was so confused. I'm like, you want me to do this stuff with no context? This is like a fun game. Okay. Yeah, I will say this. I will say we always pause at this point in our live stream to say thank you to everybody that financially supports our ministry. It's a huge blessing, and we are February 3rd right now. What that means is that we just wrapped up our year-end giving, and we just saw like the highest highs of our annual giving season. Nothing beats December. It's humbling. It's awesome. It balances our budget. We hit our goals. We fell like just a little short of what we called our stretch goal. We're still set to go behind on our budget this year. So I'm still out there trying to raise some money, but I got to tell you that year end was the best year end we've ever had. And it's just awesome. And we love it. I will say this, some of you, and I have to make sure I emphasize, for those of you that give monthly to our ministry, it is such a big deal. Like year-end giving, we talk about this huge number, and people give big gifts because they own businesses and they write these huge checks that make a whole big difference. But then there's this like chunk of you, and there's so many of you that give $5 a month, $10 a month, $25 a month, and you've been giving it for 2-3 years, more than that. And when you add all of that up, that is the game. That's like the financial center of gravity that enables us to keep moving and keep going forward. And I don't want that to get lost in the year-end campaigns. We are noticing that the amount of new monthly givers is starting to kind of plateau. And that's largely because I'm afraid maybe I haven't been talking about that enough. Like, you guys are awesome and you rock. And there's always more. So even though they're starting to plateau, like, there's still more of you today than there ever has been. So it's still going in the right direction. But if you ever think that like you're not making a difference, or if you're like, oh, maybe I would like, does $10 a month really make a difference? Yes, because there's so many of you out there doing that. And so if you have been thinking about supporting us, you can't do like $5,000 checks, but I can do $10 a month. Like that kind of stuff. Chef's kiss. Awesome. Love it. You guys are awesome. And it really enables us to keep doing what we're doing. Enables Brent to be paid, Brian to be paid, Amber to be paid, and enables us to reimburse Reed and Elle and Josh for their time on the podcast. All the things. And it's awesome. And enables us to try to get better at what we do. Because we got some room to grow, right, Brent Billings? We're not on the top of the podcast mountain.
Nope, not there. And there's that kind of sort of transitions into Betty's comment. Yeah. Betty on Facebook. She says, hello from Atlanta, working my way through Bema with a friend. We're currently in session 2 in the prophets. Love that. It has completely changed how I read the Bible. Thank you for bringing the Bible alive for me. That's exactly how I felt. So thank you for those comments, Betty. And then she says, Marty, I plan to be at the church where you will be in Atlanta on February 23rd. Can't wait. Betty, this is a special shout out to you, but anybody else who saw that email go out, that is not the location Marty will be at. Sometimes we make mistakes, and that location fell through, but there is a new location. It is on the Bema website and Marty's website. But here, I'll just show it to you. Why not?
Why not?
What am I doing here? There we go. Okay. So, Bema, discipleship.com/news. The Bema Messenger is the way to get that information pushed to you. But the problem is, once we push that information out, it cannot be updated. So that is where the website comes in. Always check the website for the latest details. But Marty will be preaching at The Path.
Yep. And there's a chance, Betty, that I'll still end up, I have to actually get back. I have a message from Northview in my unreads. So I need to get back to them. I may be doing a meet and greet of some kind, or some kind of something still there as well. So all that will end up at the same spot that Brent's showing you. I will be preaching on that day at the Path, but I'm still trying to get like 3 or 4 more events in the larger Atlanta area. So I'm just going to nail those down, and whatever I get nailed down will end up there. Might only be 2 or 3, but there should be a couple more options that are going to pop up there. So come find me, Betty, at any of those that work out for you.
I actually love this so much because you're there for 11 days in Georgia and Florida. That is only in a couple weeks, and you don't even have your plans finalized. And I'm like, Marty, man after my own heart right now.
Yeah. This is not how I usually do things. No. I have failed myself and everyone.
But yeah, lots of stuff coming up. Marty and I are going to be somewhere together. We're going to be in Wichita, Kansas. Andover actually is where the meet and greet will be. But we'll be in that area. We're going to go up to Manhattan for a day. Marty's going to be in North Carolina after that. So lots of stuff coming up. Keep on top of the messenger. Keep on top of the website. We'll keep you updated for that stuff. Okay, so then James says hello from Spokane, Washington. I know James and Allison. They're wonderful group leaders. He says, we just launched our fall semester Bema group with almost 20 people in our house fall semester. I don't quite understand how your academic calendar works, but that's fine. 20 people in the house is awesome. I love how they do groups. They have a really cool way of integrating new people into the group. They kind of like a little breakout group where they get people up to speed and then bring them into the main group. Really cool. But the Bema podcast reboot is up to episode 5 now. So this is a great time to start a new group. If you're looking to start a group, check out the reboot. It is replacing the episodes in the podcast feed. If you do want the old ones, they're there, which leads me to my next comment. This is from Christopher on Twitter. I sure miss the old days of Bema. I loved season 2 and 1 and 3 and 4. I don't know if there's something to that order, but I'm thinking maybe Christopher's favorite season is 2, which is awesome. And then he says, after that, it went away from Bible learning and went elsewhere. And I just want to argue with you a little bit, Christopher, because there's so much Bible after that. We did have to spend some time figuring out what we were going to do exactly and how we were going to structure everything. And we've kind of settled into a rhythm at this point. But we're doing, like Marty is just wrapping up a verse-by-verse study of Hosea, 14 episodes on Hosea. We went through the entire Gospel of John verse by verse. We've come back and revisited Matthew in some new directions. We've talked about parables. We've talked about, so much Bible. Yes, there's other stuff mixed in too, but lots and lots of Bible. So if you looked at like the first 2 or 3 episodes of session 6 and you're like, oh, they're done with the Bible, definitely not done with the Bible. So please, but also we're rebooting everything. So if you just want to go back and do sessions 1 through 4 again, like we've got fresh stuff going on there too. And Donnie wants to know, Marty, what's the next series since you're wrapping up Hosea? So thankful for you and the entire Bema team.
Oh, Donnie, that's a great question. It will probably be something. I always do a Bible book. Like to Christopher's point, I'm always a Bible guy. So I love to dive into something Bible-y. So it was Isaiah last season. It was Hosea this season. I will probably do something unusual just to break me out of that mold a little bit, to Christopher's, I'm sure, frustration. But the other teammates, well, I'm sure we'll dive into different. I think Josh is doing Ecclesiastes in this season. So, but I don't know yet. I've got some things that are on the future docket. I just don't know how many seasons out they might be. So I got a call with the Bema team this next week, and we're going to talk about the next season. And I got to get an answer to that question, Donnie, because I don't have one at the moment. I don't know what's next.
The pressure's on.
The pressure's on. I don't know. So we'll dig into something and we'll try to figure out what we want to do there. But I don't know what's up for me. But the other team members probably have some great ideas. So I'm excited for what's coming. If you're talking just this season, Elle's going to dive back into Talmudical Matthew. Josh has got that series on Ecclesiastes. I think Reed Dent's going to do a whole series on vices and virtues. So like the 7 deadly sins and then the 3 virtues of faith, hope, and love. So we got some fun stuff coming in. So yeah, I think I don't know. There you go. Dive into the next one, Brent.
Lions 8804 was back again saying a new group is starting up in Indianapolis under their direction. So just celebrating those new groups that are starting up. You're welcome to start up anytime, of course, but this is a good time to start up with the reboot. And then Rich, I'll let you do this one. This feels a little self-serving to read this myself.
I was wondering how you're going to do this. I was like, well, Rich says something that we can all get behind. Rich says, Brent is my hero. He needs more props. So, and all God's people said, amen.
And how did that comment get into the document, Marty? I put it there.
He sure did. And I'm glad he did.
All right.
That's awesome.
Enough of these lighthearted questions and comments.
Enough of this.
Back to the real stuff.
Back to the real stuff. All right. Hayden had a question live on YouTube. Hayden said, I'm a youth pastor for only 3 weeks now. I use a lot of Bema language and discipleship techniques. Do you have any tips or ideas on what youth and Bema looks like? That's a great question, Hayden. I would ask you that. You tell me what you find out. I do know that Bema and youth are very capable of going together. I've heard lots of people I used to be a youth minister years a couple decades ago. I did that work for a handful of years. I know what youth are capable of. I know we can do far more with youth than, so I know that Bema, if it works, it works. If it doesn't, you wouldn't have. But I'd be anxious, Hayden, to find out what you find out, what works, what doesn't. And youth is right at that bubble where, like, a lot of times people will be asking us for children's, younger preteen and young adults or young kids, I should say, children, and that material. And we'll talk about, pedens telling God's story and all that kind of stuff. Youth are at that place where that's probably less of a thing. I have a friend staying with us right now. And he was recommending a book that I haven't read yet, but I would trust his recommendation. The Teenage Mind, the Teenage Brain. I can't remember what the exact title was. Maybe Brent can find it. But it's all about the psychology of what's happening with a teenager, neurologically. I don't know if that's the right term. Neuroscience. I'm not a scientist, but and he was just saying he's a chaplain, and he was like, he's a chaplain for an all boys high school, and he was just saying this book is like radically changed for him, the way that he engages those things. So there's that. Yeah, I wish I had better thoughts. I think Bema fits with youth just fine, with probably very little adjustments. Probably just the vehicle that you use to get it to them. Looks like it's The Teenage Brain, a neuroscientist survival guide to raising adolescents and young adults. Frances Jensen and Amy Nutt. There you go. Okay. Awesome. All right. Samantha says this. Sorry, I don't have a better answer for you, Hayden. Sorry. Moving on to Samantha. She says, I've been taught in the church that when Jesus said on the cross, my God, why have you forsaken me? That it was something to the effect, or just because Jesus couldn't feel God doesn't mean God ever left him. Or I've been taught that God has to be away from Jesus because of the sin, and Jesus took on the cross. But I was told recently by a friend who was taught by a pastor in Ghana that the quote is a throwback to Psalm 22. Is that accurate? I'm not a fan of how the church teaches this passage. Yeah, sure, Samantha. Yes. And we do talk about this, and I'm not talking about the life psalm conversation, Brent. But we do talk about, because there's something that we had this fun little journey later in the podcast where we were trying to remember where we talked about life psalms, and we've determined that we never did. Like, we essentially did it in class. But we were eventually talking about Psalm 22. The answer to your question is yes. Jesus is without a doubt quoting Psalm 22. Now, I would point out a couple things. Is Jesus experiencing the same kind of frantic anxiety, the feeling of desertion, fear, and lament? Are those real things he's experiencing? Feeling like any of us do when the psalmist says, my God, why have you forsaken me? Is he experiencing that? Yes, he is. I would imagine he's experiencing that. I'm not talking about the theological reality. I hate that teaching too, that Jesus and God are somehow separated. I'm not even sure how that works in Trinitarian theology. I'm not, whatever. I too would want to somewhat reject that separation, that theological separation idea. Excuse me. I would not want to reject that theology at the expense of seeing Jesus experience these things. And I wouldn't want to get rid of it at the expense of thinking that Jesus is like not at all experiencing what he would call forsakenness. But Jesus is absolutely clearly referencing Psalm 22. There was a Jewish scholar by the name of Shmuel Safrai. He was a teacher at Hebrew University when my teachers were at Hebrew University in Jerusalem. And he did a teaching. I was told it was a dissertation. We have not been able to track it down. We have looked and looked and looked and looked and looked. But I was told he did a dissertation where he basically said all 7 statements that Jesus says on the cross can be found in Psalm 22. I think he had to use either the Aramaic or a Syriac version to make that work. It's not clean in the English translations. You're not going to be able to see it quite as cleanly as you'd want to. But he was making a case that like all Jesus is doing is he's reciting this psalm over and over and over again as he hangs there and he dies. And that psalm was paired up. I can't remember if it's Psalm 21, 22, 23, 20, 21, 22, 22, 23, 24. I can't remember which. There are 3 psalms that were in the Second Temple period linked up, and there was like a 3-part psalm, like a mega psalm. Like there's 3 psalms that were seen as a unit together. And that's what Jesus is quoting over and over and over again. And now when you go back and you look at Psalm 22 in the context of that teaching, you realize like, oh my goodness, Jesus is experiencing forsakenness. He is experiencing, but then the psalm, and you want to know who did? Somebody asked me about Shane Wood. Shane Wood had one of the best teachings I've ever heard on this. It's in his book, Between Two Trees. I think that's the title of the, and he had one of the best teachings I've read on this, where he says what Jesus is doing is Jesus is identifying with the struggle, the rejection, the hurt, the pain. But then Jesus is saying, but God is not ashamed of me, even in my rejection. God is not ashamed of me, God has not rejected me, even when the world rejects me. God is not ashamed of me. And Psalm 22 says, yes, where are you? Yes, I'm rejected. Yes, and yet God is for me. And I love that. Love it. Johnny says, I found Jesus was also quoting Psalm 31. Where can I find Safrai's work on Psalm 22? Yeah, like I said earlier, we've tried to find it. We've tried to track it down. We've tried numerous times. I've tried. Brent's tried. I don't know if it's behind a paywall. I don't know if it was an in-person lecture that my teachers heard. They clearly taught me about that. I have it on a recording, but I can't find any reference to cite you. But I've never heard that it's Psalm 31 over Psalm 22. That's nothing I've encountered. There are some phrases in Psalm 31 that I'm sure you can make those connections to. But I would definitely say Psalm 22 and the package psalms that are used there. That was Safrai's. I mean the quote, my God, why have you forsaken me?" is a direct lift. Obviously the context of Psalm 22, bulls surround me, they cast lots for my clothing, like all the pieces are there in Psalm 22. So but hey, hold on to Psalm 31. Maybe that's it. Who knows? I could be wrong. Megasom, hashtag Megasom, Hunter Clark says. Love that. Hunter's always here when I need him for a hashtag. Michaela says, I know you talked about life psalms somewhere in the podcast. Let's start this over again. We definitely talk about it in 298, but that is where we begin referencing the fact that we've talked about it before. And we've made it in passing. I did it in class, in a discussion group. I did it on my trips. I did it everywhere but the podcast prior to 298. There is a passing reference or two to the idea, but I didn't yeah, so there you go. So 298. Let's see here. I'm trying to discern Brent's notes. If it's important, he'll break in here. Kathy says, I was driving quite a while yesterday, and I'm ahead of your reboot. I listened to episode 8, Buried in a Genealogy, and I'm fascinated by genealogies, which is fascinating, Kathy. My mom got me all the genealogies of the Bible for Christmas. That is epic. I do my own genealogy. They fascinate me. I followed along. I'm getting good at chiasms, or at least I can answer the questions you ask before Brent does as I'm listening. I already knew about Sarai and Yiska being the same person, followed all of your Midrash examples, and all of it until you got to the barrenness issue. You made some good points. However, I did actually speak to my GYN today. Now we're cooking with gas. Somebody that knows about pregnancy and menstruation and all those things. And I asked her if there's any way to know a woman is barren without her having intercourse. She told me that unless a female doesn't menstruate, then there would be no idea that there was something wrong. If she didn't menstruate, that could mean she has no uterus, possibly has a tumor or something else. My question to you is, the genealogy is obviously one chunk of the story. They are telling us, we obviously know Sarai has a uterus, otherwise there would be no Isaac. So is it possible that they could have been married for a time before we are not being told about it, and they found out about her infertility that way? It is absolutely possible. It's just logically possible that that's the case. It would explain her age. Who knows about her singleness when she's in the house? It would explain why she's in the house, whether she's widowed or divorced and rejected or whatever it might be. Like, it would explain why she's in the house of Terah as she is. That's a possibility. I was trying to remember if there was any Jewish oral tradition that even took that stance. I have this vague memory of there being a strand of, here's the short answer. It's possible. It's absolutely possible that that's how they know. So there are multiple ways they could know. And again, so now I'm just messing with you at this point, Kathy, but you say we obviously know that Sarai has a uterus, unless otherwise there would be no Isaac. Okay. But hold on, she's having Isaac at 90 years old. So we're well into miracle territory at this point. So, I mean, I don't know. Who knows? Maybe she didn't, and then she did. Maybe she didn't, and then God did something. Like, I don't know. We're not in any, I would, when a woman's having a child at 90 years old, I would be careful of the word obviously. I'm just messing with you, Kathy, but I mean, I'm going to default to the GYN. I don't know. Who knows? Oh no. Benjamin Casperson must be listening to the live stream. The stone from which you were hewn. The rabbis say Abraham and Sarah had see, Benjamin is my rabbinical dictionary. He's my walking rabbinical dictionary. Benjamin says the rabbis also say Abraham and Sarah had underdeveloped genitals. Both of them, according to Benjamin. They connect it to Isaiah 51. The stone from which you were hewn. Oh, stop it. Oh, stop it, rabbis. I'll say stop it, Benjamin, but I will also say stop it, rabbis. Oh, that is so juicy. Oh, the rabbis. The rabbis in their midrash. Remember the rock from which you were cut and the stone from which you were hewn. Remember Abraham, your father, and Sarah, who gave you birth. Oh! Oh! Okay, Kathy, there you go. Adam says this. We think it's Adam. We don't know. Adam says there's a person. There's an Adam with a question mark, so I'm assuming we don't know for sure if it's Adam. There's a person who has been promoting that all Christians should be followed. Here's the other Sabbath question. Found it. Here's your other one, Roshan, that was asking the same thing. I'm quite conflicted by that all Christians should be following all of Torah. Now, Roshan was just asking about Sabbath. This person has found what usually is going to be found in what's called Hebrew roots, which is not the same thing as like we were talking with Roshan earlier about Seventh-day Adventists. Is going to be something different. The Hebrew roots movement will often teach that all Christians should be following Torah. Other movements too, not just Hebrew roots, but that's the popular one today that seems to make the rounds. I'm quite conflicted by this, and I don't really know where I stand on this. I know that Marty is unlikely to respond, but I'm keen to hear his thoughts. Surprise, surprise! Here I am to respond. And then he links the teaching that is sent his way. The teaching says this: Torah is often perceived as law in religious context, but it's much more accurately understood as an instructional guide for living in covenant with Yahweh. I mean, I appreciate what's being said. There's definitely truth in that. I don't like how that's framing things. This covenant wasn't limited to any single tribe, but extended to all Israel. Okay? As far as 12 tribes of Israel, yeah. The original intent was that Israel would be a light to the nations, displaying Yahweh's ways, inviting others to join in this covenant. Yes, definitely light to the nations, displaying Adonai's ways. No explicit command to have others join the covenant. That was never a part of the Hebraic approach. This goes beyond ritual. It reflects his character through obedience and righteousness. Maybe, maybe not, depending on what we want to do with that. Next, who is Israel? Let's use the scripture to define. And then there's going to be basically a 5-point straw man argument here about defining Israel. Israel refers to the descendants of Jacob, renamed Israel by Adonai, forming the 12 tribes. Yes, Israel is used in a lot of ways. That's one of many, 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 many ways of using that. Number 2, Israel's identity is rooted in covenant relationship, marked by obedience to Adonai. Israel's identity is rooted in a covenant. Yes, the covenant of Sinai. Absolutely. Gentiles who join through faith in Yeshua are grafted into Israel's covenant. They are grafted, according to the New Testament, Romans and Galatians, not into the Sinai covenant, but into the family of faith. And Paul makes a very clean distinction. Usually, people that are in this worldview, whether this is Hebrew roots or not, I'm making assumptions. But people that are in this movement usually will reject Paul, at least in part. They will reject the inspiration of Paul, because you have to. Because they're usually not ignorant of Paul. Some of them are, but usually they're not ignorant of Paul, but they reject Pauline letters, because Galatians and Romans argues directly against that concept. It feels good. They actually quote Romans 11, the whole grafting in thing, and yet Romans and what they're being grafted into is not an Israelite covenant, but to a family tree. But they are not now all of a sudden, they are still a wild uncultivated olive branch. They're not now a cultivated olive branch. They are still Gentile. They don't become Jewish. They're still very Gentile. This would fit Galatians, where Paul very clearly says you don't. You're in the family of Abraham, but you're not under the same covenant law. He makes that distinction in Galatians. Not all physical descendants are true Israel. Those living by faith and obedience are counted as Israel. Yes, I would want to be real careful with how that's being applied as it's being applied here. I mean, that's not a mechanical reality. That's not a transactional truth. That's a poetic, prophetic truth that changes the moment anybody wants to walk in obedience. So your covenantal status doesn't change. Israel's role is to reflect Adonai's ways and to bring his light to the nations. Israel's role is to do that, yes. And by proxy, the church kind of gets invited into the same role, not because they're a member of the same covenant, but because they're a member of the same family and ergo the same mission. Israel is defined by covenant obedience and faith in Yeshua, involving both natural descendants and those grafted in. I squarely think the New Testament teaches against that. We're not supposed to be grafted into these man-made. Now, I'm going to be all about the last line. We're not supposed to be grafted into man-made doctrines. Amen and amen. Amen and amen. The problem is that this perspective is no more historically informed than any of the other man-made doctrines. We've just exchanged one doctrinal understanding with another one, because there's no Jewish source that would parse this out the same way. Jews aren't going to read their own book that way. So we're all just exchanging man-made doctrines for man-made doctrines, and we shouldn't do that. So we want our stuff to be as objectively informed by historical, and even that'll never be perfect. They'll never be perfect. We'll never have a perfect hermeneutic. We'll never have something that's perfectly, beautifully, holistically objective. It's always going to be messy. It's always going to be complicated. This approach is just as welcome at the table of critical thought as anything else. But I think there are some objective ways why I would say that's not how I understand it. We'll put it that way. So there you go. Yeah, that was clunky, Adam. Sorry about that. But my thoughts are, your question was, Marty is unlikely to respond, but I did. But I would be keen to hear his thoughts about this matter. My thoughts are, I disagree. I disagree in some significant ways with that perspective. Doesn't mean I'm right. Just means it's how I see it. And there's some relatively objective scholarship that leads me to believe that. That's relatively mainstream. Lions 8804 live question. I have Eastern Orthodox friends who are insistent on the perpetual virginity of Mary and all the baggage that comes with that. Not being fruitful and multiplying after marriage seems antithetical to Jewish thought. It's such a good question, and I just hate the way that we frame it because of our relationship to doctrine. I appreciate what you're saying. I get that, and yes, Lions 8804. I also appreciate. I mean, I come to appreciate. I don't agree with a lot of that. Those doctrinal positions of Catholicism or Eastern Orthodoxy. But I appreciate where they come from. I appreciate why they hold to that. Usually, if you get like underneath the surface and you see like all the places where this doctrine has legs, like where it goes and what it's doing and what it's trying to, like the wisdom underneath the surface level thing, like there's usually like just some incredible beauty behind what some of these things are doing theologically. It's deeply theological. I don't have a bone necessarily. It's just it's not where I'm at. Like I don't spend a whole bunch of time wrestling with the perpetual virginity of Mary. And depending on who I'm talking to, I'll have more resonance with others as far as why that's important or what the implications of that are. But I'm fine. I'm fine with my Eastern Orthodox brothers and sisters. I'm fine with my Catholic brothers and sisters. I'm in a Catholic institution right now, learning a ton from their tradition. Learning. And there's a lot of things that aren't for me. There's a lot of things that I don't agree with. There's a lot of things that I do. I'm good. It's kind of one of those things where it's like, oh yeah, you believe in that? I don't. That's cool. But I like your point, like not being fruitful and multiplying. It is antithetical to Jewish thought. Yes, but that's not necessarily what they're trying to do with the perpetual virginity of Mary. They're not necessarily trying to do something Jewish with Mary. They're trying to do something Christological. They're trying to make a point about God and how it interacts with the nature of God, the nature of man, the collision of these two worlds between the kingdom of heaven and earth. And there's a lot of things going on there. So I'm like, All right. Olivia says, I had a question about Acts 10 where Peter heard a voice telling him not to call anything impure that God has made clean. And Marty taught that that he goes on to understand that as God never called people unclean. I went back to Leviticus to find clarification on that and found a few scriptures in chapter 11 saying that if someone does something, then they are considered unclean. Okay. Great question, Olivia. Great question. So a person you can receive uncleanliness. Uncleanliness passes from something that's unclean, a cloth that's unclean, or a utensil that's unclean, or an animal that's unclean. And that uncleanliness can then make you unclean. So now you're unclean, and then but it's a state of uncleanliness, not like the pig is unclean. But a human being's natural state is not unclean. There's no human being whose natural state is unclean. They can receive uncleanliness as a state that usually goes away that evening at sundown when you bathe, you do mikveh, and now that cleanliness goes away. Sometimes it's 7 days with things like menstruation or dead body or childbirth. Which brings us to another part. There is a difference between, again, the thing that is unclean, as the essence of that thing is unclean. It is unclean to consume that because that thing is unclean in and of itself, versus the word unclean in reference to temple, ritual purification. So am I pure enough to enter the assembly of God, to enter the temple, to enter the temple courts, to go to synagogue, to engage in any of those? Am I ritually clean versus carrying the status of unclean? Have I done what's required to make myself clean enough so there are two different references in the Levitical code, both to a thing that is in essence and nature unclean in and of itself, a lizard, a rabbit, is unclean. You're not allowed to eat it because it is unclean in and of itself. Then I can take on that status of uncleanliness. So those distinctions are important in that regard, because people themselves, there's no person who is unclean in the same way. What was in the sheet? I should have just said it this way. I'm like, blah, 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 blah. Here, I should have just said it this way. The sheet comes down and the sheet is full of reptiles, unclean animals, all the things you can't eat, the things that are in and of themselves unclean. There is no person that would be in that sheet. A person can be unclean, but there is no person who is, in essence, there is no people group that is, in their essence, inherently, to begin with, as they are, unclean. Their essence as a human being is clean. That's what we meant to communicate. Great distinction. And I don't even know, sometimes it's hard for us to get our head around that. I am clean, but I can make myself unclean, but my natural state is clean. The pig is never clean according to the Levitical code. It is always unclean. It's not clean and then becomes unclean. It is inherently identified as an unclean thing, and no human being is. I hope that clears that up. It's getting late. Zach says, why does the JPS Tanakh read so differently than any other Bible I have? Is there a benefit of having a JPS Tanakh? Golly, I don't feel like I've had that experience. I feel like they're actually often so similar. Yeah, they're different because they're being translated by a completely different people group with completely different motivations, theological assumptions, parameters. They're being driven by tradition and midrash and centuries of things that are just not at play at all. What's striking to me is that they're so blasted similar. I pull out my JPS all the time, and usually it's pretty darn close to what I'm reading in the English. And I'm looking for those one or two words in a passage that are pretty significantly different. And that I love having. I will pull out a JPS Tanakh all the time for the study notes, for the stuff that's included in there, for just the translation itself. And the translation changes. They release a new version very, very regularly. I love having a JPS Tanakh because I want to see how a Jew is translating this. No Jesus, no Christian theology. I just want to hear how a Jew hears this passage. That's so helpful for me. And I don't feel like it's super different. So it might depend on what we're reading, Zachary, but it's a good question. I feel like I've had the opposite. Now there's plenty of differences. Don't get me wrong. I've just been floored. Maybe I expected it to be even more different. I don't know. But they're not doing the same thing. They don't have the same goals, and they don't have the same assumptions, which leads to a different translation at times. Claudia says, if God blesses Sabbath day as a day of rest, oh goodness, there's more of these in this one. I didn't realize there was another one. If God blesses Sabbath day as a day of rest, Saturday, should we keep it as a day of rest instead of Sunday? Why do most Christian churches say Sunday as a Sabbath day? Well, the problem is that we keep conflating worship service with Sabbath. And lots of Jews in Judea, the practice in Judea was to go to synagogue on the Sabbath. But the Sabbath was not about a worship service. The Sabbath was the Sabbath. And in Judea, your worship service was a part of your Sabbath observance. In the Galilee, scholars have been convinced at times that they did they did synagogue worship service at the beginning of Sabbath, so that the Sabbath was a more true Sabbath. That's honestly how I as a Jewish follower of Jesus, I have Sabbath on Saturday, and I don't do worship service. I do worship service on Sunday. That's just a personal, selfish perspective. I love that. I love that Sabbath is Sabbath and worship is worship. I'm fine with the fact that we connect our worship to things like the resurrection, to things like Pentecost. We could debate historically whether or not those things are connected to paganism, whether or not that's connected to the Roman Lord's Day. But then we're going to have to say, okay, if it is connected to the Roman Lord's Day, and I'm not sure it is, but if it is, let's just say we could prove that it was. So were the early believers trying to subvert it? Or were they tongue-in-cheek referencing Shabbat as Lord's Day? How are those phrases being used? Those are great Those are great questions to wrestle with. Again, worship service for me, not the same, not interchangeable with Sabbath. Sabbath is Sabbath. I can worship at a Wednesday night service. I don't care. I can worship on a Sunday morning. I can worship at a Saturday night. I can worship at worship service is not Sabbath observance for me. And again, I've worked at and grown up in too many mega churches where we have about 4 services throughout the week. So I got Thursday and I got Saturday morning and I got 3 on Sunday. I got Sunday night. So worship service for me is not connected to Sabbath observance. In fact, for me, worship service always has been a work day. It's the work day, which was similar to the priest. Jesus said, "Don't you know that the priests desecrate the Sabbath, and yet it's still called holy?" So, I mean, that's the role of clergy. But I think I would want to detangle and differentiate between Sabbath and worship. As far as a worship service, I mean, the church gathered worship service and Sabbath observance. I think those are 2 different things. They can go together. They can also be separate. And if that's helpful to make that distinction, great. And if that like really bothers you and you're like, then that's cool. Like link it up and do whatever you got to do. For me, those are not the same thing. Both of them are important. Both of them should happen. They can happen on the same day. They do not have to. There you go. Johnny on YouTube says, what do you think about the suggestion that the 2 sons in the prodigal son parable are Ephraim and Judah, the 2 houses, kingdoms of Israel? It's a take. And I could see it. Like I could see it. There's just so many better options. The 2 sons are quite deliberately and quite literally Jacob and Esau. Like the father literally does word for word what Esau does in the story. Like the story is just think about the prodigal son story. It's literally the story of Jacob and Esau. You can make the connections to Ephraim and Judah. You could do that. I get real nervous that when we do that, we're doing the 2-house covenant theory, which I'm not a fan of and don't hold to. I'm not a fan of the 2 houses theory. But I mean, you could connect that, but that's usually the people that are making that connection are usually trying to do the 2 covenant houses, Ephraim representing this, Judah representing that, Gentiles and Jews and all that kind of, that's, I just don't think that's what's going on at all in the prodigal son. You also have Pharaoh and Egypt. You have so many other connections that are cleaner and I feel like more obvious before Ephraim and Judah. So can be, it's not like bananas. It's not some crazy idea with it's like a total reach, but usually there's a particular theological motivation to trying to connect those 2. And there doesn't have to be, but when there is, I'm usually like, it's not my cup of tea. I want to use that same hermeneutic that a Jewish rabbi would use. I don't want to be driven by theology. I want to be driven by what is a rabbi trying to teach? What's the point here? What's the context? I don't feel like the Judah-Ephraim connection speaks to the setup. The whole setup is about the Pharisees not taking care of the outsiders. The Pharisees are so upset that the sinners are in the. So for me, I don't feel like Judah-Ephraim nails that. I feel like Jacob-Esau nails it. Yeah, Johnny says he's not going to the 2-house theory. Good, Johnny. Good. Yeah. Oftentimes people that are promoting that theory are often going that direction. But like I said, not always. And it wasn't you. Good job. Whoa, hitting my mic. Okay, Zach. Just listened to episode 101, The Other Side, in preparation for a talk in my church about the teaching of the demoniac. This is one of my favorite teachings from Marty. It has really brought the story to life to me. Oh, man, there's another one of these questions that we have worked so hard to cite. So hard. Could someone point me to a resource or evidence which states that the Bishop of Hippos penned the Nicene Creed? I know Marty mentioned that towards the end of the episode, but upon doing a Google search, I haven't been able to find anything. I wish I knew. I can't remember if it was a live stream. I've done this before for this question. I can't think of where else it would have been other than a live stream. It might have been an email, but I've done this work. I just can't remember which live stream it would be that we could link. But anyway, I've done this work to find it. It is a loose connection that you may not be in love with. When I tracked it down, I was like, I can see why the person is making that connection. If somebody were like really like, well, prove it, you're not going to be able to prove it. But there is enough connection to who the bishop of Hippos is. He is listed amongst the people. It's Eusebius. Your source, your citation is Eusebius. And what I am discovering now is that in the academic world, that's not good enough. Which drives me crazy, by the way. Like nothing, you're going to get me fired up here. I got 6 minutes left on this live stream. Nothing makes me more frustrated than the fact that I can't quote Eusebius as a source. No. He's biased church history. If we can't quote Eusebius, then we can't like reference Josephus. We can't reference any history. Like I just don't understand. I don't understand how Eusebius is not. I understand how it's not strong. There's not like 6 different sources, but your source is Eusebius. Eusebius is going to talk about the bishops that were present. I'm almost positive. There's a link between Eusebius and you have to, and it's not strong. I will say it again. It's not some like, boom, here's a citation that says this guy was a bishop of it, because there was a council of people that penned the Nicene Creed. It wasn't just the one guy. When it was taught to me, I felt like it was taught to me like this is the guy who penned it. Like there was a council of people that put it together, but this was the guy that wrote it down. I haven't been able to like find anything that tells me that that's true. But that he was a part of the group of people that wrote it down, that created that creed, that was 1 or 2 steps removed. I could make that connection. And somewhere in there, the connection was Eusebius. Then somebody else had done the Bishop of Hippos. So it was like a 2-degree removed, which for some people is like, well, you're making a huge leap, which I would totally be like, yeah, totally. I don't know how I will shape my language when I get to the reboot about that. I will definitely soften the language of what's being said. I've already softened it in my Israel material when I teach it. I haven't gotten rid of it because I'm still there. I still believe that that's a thing. But I have softened what I'm implying and what I'm communicating with my words. But Eusebius, there you go. Brent does not have record of it in a Q&A. I don't know where I did that. I did a lot of work, though, trying to track that down. It might have been after one of my trips, because sometimes I'll have people on my trips that are like, I need a citation for that. And I may have tracked that down. In fact, now that I say that, I think I know where it is. I think that was about Philip, actually. Anyway, I did the work, and it's a little tricky. It's a little tricky. So if that bothers you, just don't put that in your lesson. Okay, Zach? Don't put it in your lesson. I'm going to soften my language, but I'm keeping it in my lesson. I've made enough of a connection that I feel like I'm in good shape there. But see if you can track it down with some of the pieces that I gave you, but just don't teach it until you feel good about it. There you go. There you go. My teacher, Ray, loved Eusebius. Ray loved Eusebius. It was like one of his primary sources. So almost everything that somebody says, cite that I learned from Ray, I have learned 80% of the time it's in Eusebius. And sometimes a couple other church historians, but Eusebius is often the primary source for a lot of the things that I got handed of that nature. And that used to be fine, and that is no longer sexy in grad work, in scholarly, academic, in the academy. That's no longer like this. Eusebius says it, so it must be true. Everybody's like, no, Eusebius says it must be wrong, which drives me nuts. Why one extreme to the other? Like, I don't understand. I am not okay with that. Callie says, is that Callie? Callie says, that is a fantastic last name. If that's a legitimate last name, I love that, Callie. Golly, that's fantastic. Callie's in session 4, listening to Romans, also listening to the Roman sermon series you attached in the notes. You mentioned Roman road a few times. Can you clarify what that means to you and what your response would be to friends who are passionate about this idea? You can Google the Romans road. Like that's a very, very prominent evangelical The Romans Road is a bunch of Romans proof texts. If you quote this verse and then go to and the whole point is that you never even have to leave the book of Romans. You can stay in the book of Romans and lead somebody to Christ. Here's for some it's like 6 references, for some it's like 11 or 12. I had to memorize the Romans Road in Bible college. Obviously, I can't remember it now, so that didn't work out very well. But they're like, you just lead to these proof texts in the book of Romans, and it leads people through a very evangelical understanding of salvation. That's the Romans Road. I'm sure Brent can even find a crazy link and throw it in there. We're not recommending that link, but if you want an example, there's going to be a bunch of those things on there. Brent just said, nah, he'll pass. But anyway, I have a book coming out in my next book. I wrote this book with Reed Dent, one of the co-hosts, and one of the chapters is a sassy little chapter that I titled a Road in Rome. And my publisher may not even let me publish it. Who knows where we'll be at the end of all this. But I have a whole chapter where I'll tell you exactly what I think about the Romans Road. So there you go. That's what the Romans Road means. The Roman Road is a set of proof texts that you can use. Start here, Romans 3:23. All have sinned and fallen short of the glory of God. The wages of sin is death, and it just kind of leads you through this, and it kind of bounces all over. And there you go. So, not a big fan of the Romans Road. In case I wasn't being clear about that. It's just not how I don't like to proof text the Bible that way. It's not how Romans was being written. Paul didn't write the Romans letter so that we would do that to it. So there you go. Ryan says, another live comment. We are 1 minute past the hour. I am a student at Regent University, and I'm studying so much of the similar Bema language under Professor Thomas Kaiser. I've heard that name. We are studying the ties between Genesis 1 and John 1. What are your all's thoughts on walking in the light and how that connects to Genesis 1 and John 1? Yeah. Yes, John loves light. And John loves the theme of light in connection with the Genesis narrative, the Genesis creation narrative. So I don't necessarily have a whole bunch of thoughts for you other than like, yes, and John is doing that. John wants to dream about a new world, a world that's being reborn, a new creation. I'm a new creation. This world is a new creation. The resurrection has changed everything. And so John is framing everything in terms of light. Now, add to that, remember John is the guy that has a connection to remember at the end when Jesus is arrested and he's in the house of the high priest, we're told that John has a family connection. That's how John and Peter get into the house and why they're in the courtyard when Jesus is being tried, right? Okay, that means John has priestly family connections. If you're a righteous priest, you are probably an Essene for anybody that's been in session 3. Now, if John has Essene connections, the Essenes were known as the sons of Zadok, and the sons of Zadok called themselves the sons of light. And the sons of light are at war against the sons of darkness. So all that does is bolster this theme that's present in John's writings, Gospel, 1st, 2nd, 3rd John, and you could throw in the book of Revelation. The theme of light. Sons of light, light of the world, creation, let there be light. Bada bing, bada boom. 10:03 p.m. Eastern time. It's time to wrap this thing up. Brent, come on back. Our next Q&A is Sunday, March 23rd. You probably won't even see my face. You will see L. Grover Fricks. She's going to have your questions about Hebrew. She's going to have your questions about women and theology and getting that perspective. She's going to have all the live questions that you guys throw out. She's going to have all kinds of fun. So March 23rd, that's a Sunday. I think it's our GMT edition. If my calendar is correct, it's the 4 p.m. version.
I believe
4
so,
p.m.
yes.
Eastern time. So there you go. So all of our international listeners will be able to join us. So,
well, at least the Europe and Africa people.
I just want to know what's happening in the Google Doc. I see something about Super Bowl, Brent, and Kendrick Lamar all on the same line. And I want to know, are you going to be out of the office on Super Bowl Sunday? What's going on here?
So I have my Parsha reading that I do at 5 p.m. Pacific time on Sundays. And somebody asked me yesterday what I'm going to do about the Super Bowl. And I was like, I don't know. That's a good question. And the idea of me counter programming the halftime show came to the forefront. And so that's probably what I'm doing. I don't even have a way to watch the Super Bowl, though. So I got to figure out how I'm going to even know when the halftime is happening. But probably that.
You probably have some friends that are connected with, I think we have some friends whose team is playing in that dumb game. But I just want you to pop out. I just want you to be a part of the halftime show. Like he's breaking down, they're not like us. They're not like us. And then you're just like out of like the smoke, you just with the parasha reading, Baymoth sweatshirt, hoodie.
Well, that's a little more involved than I was thinking. I was thinking maybe I could have the game on in the background muted or something, like over my shoulder.
Brueggemann would call it accommodate resistance, Brent. Accommodate. I want more accommodation. Less resistance, more accommodation.
All right. Well, we'll see what happens. Michaela, by the way, is amazed that we're wrapping up on time, which A, not quite, and B, there's 7 questions on the cutting room floor. So bring your questions back for L next month, I guess, is what I'd say to that.
I blame the people that got me worked up.
There's a little bit of my fault in there.
All right. Good enough.
All right, Marty. Thanks for leading us in this journey of wrestling. It's always fun.
As always, I don't feel like it was my best evening of honoring questions and whatever, but that's part of the gig. So we're here. We're having fun. Keep thinking critically. I'm just a normal person with a random set of opinions. I shouldn't say random. They're relatively informed, but that's all they are.
A strong reading habit.
Yeah, a strong. I do love that. Yeah, so thanks for joining us. Keep doing it. Keep doing the work. It's all of us together doing this thing. We're no authority any more than anybody else, so keep at it.
See y'all next time.